Hi everyone, my name is Corey Haywood and I will be hosting today's feature focus on the Do Sync button action in TracerPlus Desktop. Typically, you would want to use a Do Sync button when you want to activate the sync remotely from the device, rather than docking the device in the cradle and activating the sync through the buttons in the Connect Management Studio. So what I've done here is I've kind of set up a very basic work order app, and this is kind of an ideal scenario because the worker out in the field is not going to necessarily want to have to walk back to the Connect PC to sync their new jobs every time they get them. So what I've done here is I've put a button on the form here, and the first step when setting up a sync button is to set a button on your form to the Do Sync button action. So I will do that here. Once you've done that, there's two key settings here, the Sync Host ID and the Sync Profile ID. The Sync Host ID is going to refer to the host configured in the Project tab of your TracerPlus desktop project. So if we go back to our Project tab here, this host value is going to refer to any host that we have in this list. So we don't have one yet, so I'm going to add one here. And the host ID in this case is just going to be the IP address of my Connect machine. So I've added my host, its ID is 1. So we're going to go back to our sync button, and we're just going to make sure that the sync host ID is set to 1 here, which it is. Likewise, the sync profile ID is going to refer to the ID value of the profile we're trying to activate in our Connect project. So I'm going to pull up the TracerPlus Connect here, and I'm just going to look for my profile ID, which I want to activate. In this case, in my project, I only have one profile, and its profile ID is 1, which can be found here. So I'm going to go back to desktop, and I'm just going to again confirm that my sync profile ID is set to 1. Now the last thing that we really need to do for this button is just give it a good label. In this case, I think we'll call it Sync Jobs. And so now that our button is configured, I'm just going to deploy these changes to my device. And if we pull up the device here, we should have our sync button here. So now, if I hit this button, it's going to reach out to the Connect server. It's going to sync all that, all those processes that are in the profile that we've assigned to this. So as you can see here, the jobs have been synced to the device, and now they're visible in our grid here. So let's say we only wanted the jobs for Joe, for example. Instead of syncing all of these, another feature of the sync button is what we call a dynamic sync filter. And what we can do with that is we can basically say only send the records that have the employee Joe in them. And so what we have for that is we have a field where we have our values here with Joe, and then we're going to configure this sync button to kind of use this value in a filter that we also set up in Connect. So to do that, the first thing that we'll do is we will set up our filter, dynamic sync filter on the button here. And the way you do that is you'd select your sync button, and then you'd come down to the filters section here, and here's where you can actually add these filters. So in this particular case, our profile ID is going to be 1 because we only have our one profile, we only have one process, so it'll be 1 in this case. And again, our filter ID here is also going to be 1. We haven't made this filter yet, but I will point that out once we do that in Connect. The last thing you select here is just the field that you want the value to come from. So in this case, it's going to be our employee field. And so that's really it for the device component of the dynamic filter. Now that we have that deployed there, I'm going to configure the Connect side of things for that filter. So if we go to our Configure tab here, all of our filtering will always be done on the source tab. And so we'll click the options here. We'll add our source filter. Here's that ID value that I mentioned earlier. This just indicates which filter the value is going to get placed in. So in this particular case, the value from the employee field will be placed in our ID1 filter here. And so now we're just going to configure the filter to basically say when employee field equals the dynamic value from the device, only send those records that meet that criteria. And so that's pretty much it for the dynamic sync filter. So now if we go back to our device here, and this time let's select Joe, and we'll run our sync again, what we should see is only 2 records for only the jobs that are Joe's. And that's what we see here. So now say, Howie picks up this device, he can select himself and then hit sync jobs, and it should grab only his job as opposed to everyone's. So again, that's kind of a powerful feature that the sync button gives, that the sync buttons in the Management Studio and Connect don't really have. They don't have access to that dynamic filter. You can only do static filters with those buttons, but when you're configuring a button on the device, you can use a value from the device to trigger a filter, which can be a pretty useful thing to do in TracerPlus. That pretty much sums up the feature focus for today. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email at support@tracerplus.com.